Welcome, everybody. Thanks for turning out on this steamy hot day for some cooler weather inside with our speaker, Anthony Samarco, who is a local historian, and he's an author of many books, over 60 books on the history of Boston alone. He was here earlier. He gave a program on Filene's basement, or Filene's store, department store, which maybe some of you joined that program. And we're delighted to have him back again for this program about the Great Boston Fire. And please mute your cell phones for the program, and also join me in giving Anthony a nice warm welcome. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you. I was a little astonished with the traffic. We're at our summer house in Alsterville, so I gave 2 hours. I thought that's more than enough time. I couldn't believe the traffic, so I apologize. I write local history. I teach at Boston University at the Metropolitan College, and I've done that for 35 years, but I had a financial career. I always loved history. So I've written books, not just on the neighborhoods of the city of Boston and the surrounding areas, including 4 on Milton, where we lived for about 25 years. But I also have done things on things that are quite important to us that no longer exist. The history of Howard Johnson's, the history of Jordan Marsh, the history of the Baker Chocolate Company. I just finished the history of the Christmas tree shops. So these are things you laugh, but the thing is that was something in a lot of ways was crafting something that the founder wanted, but she basically didn't know what she wanted. But this book on Inferno was written for the 150th anniversary of the Great Boston Fire of 1872. I grew up hearing about this. My grandfather, who was born in 1879, would speak of his father going to Boston to actually see the conflagration and the whole aspect of destroying 65 acres of downtown Boston. When we think about it, it went from the Old South Church along Washington Street to Filene's at Summer Street, and thence all the way to the waterfront. So the book itself chronicles, both in photographs and in text, this wonderful history, if one can think of a fire as being wonderful. But the aspect is, this was a detail on the cover of a Currier and Ives print of 1873. We see the dome of the Massachusetts State House, the spires of the various churches, and of course the raging fire. Well, the area that was destroyed was called the Old South End, not the South End of Boston today, but what we would know today as the business district. In the mid-19th century, Boston was undergoing major changes through the topographical infilling of the new South End on either side of the neck of Boston, the massive infilling of the Back Bay marshes, as well as the increase in population through matriculation and immigration. Following the Civil War, Boston was to see its population increase to 250,000 by 1870, of which one half were either immigrants or the children of immigrants. The city was embracing change, ethnic as well as religious, and was a far cry from the homogeneous town settled by the Puritans from England in 1630. By 1872, much of the former residential district known as the Old South End had given way to commerce. Summer, Bedford, Kingston, Arch, Franklin, and Federal Streets, and others that had been the pride of the Athens of America. But by the 1860s, most of its residents had moved to the newly filled South End, the Back Bay, and the suburbs. The area was rebuilt with impressive 5-story commercial blocks that not only changed the face of Boston, but were architecturally impressive with their splendid fronts that became the pride of Victorian Boston, its merchants, and the Bostonians who now thronged the area. The area was residential, and seen here is Summer Street. At the junction, we see the octagonal church designed by Charles Bulfinch, one of 19 places of worship in Boston he did design, and of course the buildings on either side. This area of Summer Street was not only so tony that we realized that Samuel Adams Drake, author of Old Landmarks and Historic Personages of Boston, said, "Summer Street was, beyond dispute, the most beautiful avenue in Boston, shaded by a grove and a light softened by the leafy screen and over the shadows of the big elms lying across the pavement." In that instance, we realize in this photograph of 1860, the residential quality of the neighborhood around Summer Street is evident by this photograph on the left of the early 1860s, with the corner of the portico of the octagonal church on the right and row houses on the left along Bedford Street leading to Chauncey Street. The wide expanse of the open square paved in cobblestones created an impressive approach to the church and has long been known as Church Green, which it still is today. But the area also had houses that actually emulated what we would see built on Beacon Hill. And seen here is a duplex that was built on Summer Street, roughly today the site of the Blue Cross Blue Shield building, that was indicative of the well-designed houses built in the 1830s. As the neighborhood changed and became less desirable as a place of residence, this duplex house was demolished in 1865. It stood fewer than 35 years. The area, in some ways, would embrace this concept of a commercial base. And this is Franklin Street, with its very gentle elliptical arc on the right-hand side, originally laid out in the 1790s by Charles Bulfinch, and included the first row houses in New England, but which was known as the Tontine Crescent. And this was an upscale neighborhood of the first half of the 19th century, but by the 1850s, the city was expanding commercially. The row houses were demolished, but the gentle elliptical arc of Bulfinch's street would actually be replicated in these 5-story, granite-fronted commercial buildings. And on the far right-hand side would be Arch Street, to give you a rough idea of how the area changed. As the area changed and buildings were demolished, even the Cathedral of the Holy Cross that was originally in the business district and had moved to the south end would see its lot developed by a man named Patrick Donahue as the Cathedral Building, built on its site. This was designed by Joseph Billings, and of course we realized that the area itself at Franklin and Devonshire Streets had changed from a place of residential abode to a commercial one. Well, this building, which was actually 6 stories in height, was not only where the Boston Pilot was printed, which I'm sure we all read every Friday, but it was also something that actually Patrick Donahue had the Immigrant Saving Bank on the ground floor, where many people would actually save. These buildings were indicative of how Boston was changing, and this building at Winthrop Square was called the Beebe Block, and it was an impressive 5-story commercial block with a mansard roof that was at Devonshire and Otis Streets. The block was named for James Madison Beebe, a very well-known and wealthy dry goods merchant, and the story would carry on an enormous amount of dry goods throughout the country, but it was seen here as something that by the period of 1870 was just the most wonderful thing that Boston could see. But in that period, you have to realize by the area of October of 1872, Boston was changing, but so too wasn't the fact that every horse in Boston had the equine flu, and I call it an epizootic in Boston. In the fall of 1872, Boston was in the throes of an equine influenza that affected horses, most of whom began to show symptoms such as a cough and general sluggishness. The disease was said to have emanated from Canada, and within weeks, the symptoms had become prevalent in Boston. Horses showed a series of common symptoms, including a discharge from the nostrils and eyes, a rasping cough, general exhaustion, and an inability to work. Well, the whole concept was, it sounded terrible, but the equine flu put a little bit of a glitch into the Boston economy. It was a serious situation because the impact on Boston by the affected horses was devastating, especially as horses were vital in not just pulling carriages and carts, but also in the delivery of foods, goods, and supplies. And the result was that manpower was necessary, and it extended to the transportation of fire engines if needed a fire. Well, seen here, families would actually be distraught. It wasn't just a family horse, but this horse obviously pulled this man's carriage or cart that he did his trade. He was devastated, and 15% of the horses in Boston would die between October 1st and November 30th of 1872. In that instance, streetcars that would be pulled by horses were now pulled by human labor. And of course, we realize that this is the Norfolk House car, car 86, and it's actually something that connected Boston via the South End to Roxbury, turning at the Norfolk House at Roxbury Meeting House Hill. And with most of the horses in Boston suffering from the equine flu, conductors and passengers are depicted in this etching pulling a streetcar along its tracks to the Appazuic. It's not recorded if they had to pay their nickel fare. But even in the period, these etchings in Harper's Weekly would actually be quite jolly, the poor horses. This was an etching called The Chivalrous Patient, and it depicts a horse suffering from the Appazuic with his hooves in a warm pail of water, a blanket around his shoulders, and a steaming hot toddy and medicine beside him. It was jocular, but it was also quite serious, and we realized that Boston, in this period, had grown to such proportions. Remember, 250,000 people on an 800-acre peninsula, that the area seen here in an 1863 photograph, which is called Boston, as the eagle and wild goose see it, was a detail of a photograph taken by James Black. And it was taken from Samuel King's hot air balloon called the Queen of the Air. In 1863, Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote in the Atlantic Monthly, Boston, as the eagle and wild goose see it, is a very different place from the same place as the solid citizen looks up at its eaves and chimneys. And if you look at the photograph, midpoint on the left-hand side, you see the spire of the Old South Meeting House. Follow it down 45 degrees to the crenellated tower of Trinity Church, and then in the back was everything that was destroyed. During that period, Boston had seen tremendous amounts of growth, and many of the buildings were really quite splendid. This is the Cluse building where the fire began. It was at 83 Summer Street at the corner of Kingston Street, and the building was constructed in 1866 by Seaman Cluse, a German immigrant and a wealthy merchant, and ironically an incorporator of the Boston Globe. The ground floor was rented to Tibbetts, Baldwin, and Davis Company, wholesale dry goods merchants. The second floor to Damon, Temple and Company, dealers in men's furnishing goods, and the upper floors to Alexander Young Company, which manufactured hoop skirts, bustles, and corsets, something that I don't think any one of our wives or girlfriends actually wear anymore. And the fire started in the basement of the building around 7 p.m. from a spark from the coal furnace. And of course, it ignited a bale of cotton. And because these buildings had elevators, it went up the elevator shaft just like a chimney and not only encompassed the building, but the roof, which had a wood trussing, would actually begin to burn. Well, not only did it begin at 7 o'clock, the alarm was only raised at 7:24 p.m., and the call board at City Hall indicated that Box 52 had been pulled. By 8 p.m., all of Boston's 21 engines were on the scene. But the problem was, in some ways, this was a densely built-up area. And seen here is John Damrell. He was elected to the position of chief engineer of Boston in the fire department in 1866. He had already warned city officials about the danger of fire in the business and district and its concern with the water supply, shortage of fire hydrants, lack of fire equipment, and the density of tall buildings with wooden mansard roofs in the district. He said that when he arrived, there were 6 separate buildings that were on fire, and one was literally a blast furnace. Just an hour later, the situation had rapidly deteriorated. Granite fronts were exploding, and walls falling broke not just only the water mains and branches, the gas mains had also succumbed to the shock, and the gas was flowing into the cellars and sewers and through drains into the buildings. So it wasn't just a fire, it was a calamity, and we realized that gas, which was used to illuminate the dark, was now spreading the fire. And in the chapter I call The Lurid Light of a Burning Cauldron, of course, the fire had started in the Cluse building, and it was engulfed in flames in less than a few minutes. The fury of the fire rose to the wood-frame mansard roof that burnt out of reach of fire hoses, and continued unabated until the flames inevitably spread from one mansard roof to the next. The heat from the burning buildings, the geysers of sparks and embers became infernal, and its intensity caused the granite facades to implode, falling to the street. It was said that blocks of granite weighing tons were split as if by gunpowder and hurled across wide streets. The fire spread, and Russell Conwell, who would write a book on the history in 1873, said that in a falling building on Franklin Street, there were seen through the flashes of fire the forms of men attempting to leap from the windows, but they never reached the pavement. Their cries were heard above the crashing timbers and the noise of explosions, awakening shrilly echoes in the ears of those who heard, which will never cease to call. In that way, the men, who were not only the professional firefighters, but of course a volunteer cadre of firefighters, would actually go to the firehouses. They would pull an engine. Now, these engines would actually weigh anywhere from 1.5 to 2 tons, but they would have to pull it by hand 8 to 10 weeks, to 8 to 10 blocks. I can imagine how exhausted we would be if we just pulled it to the square here. Well, these men actually finally arrived at the fire, but the problem was what they called fire plugs, or what would be hydrants of today, were not only insufficient, there was only water power to reach to the 3rd story. Originally, there were 3-story row houses. Now there were 5-story commercial blocks. Within minutes, the area was engulfed in flames. And this was Patrick Donohue's cathedral building. It was completed in 1871 at the cost of $300,000, a tremendous sum of money. And because the newspaper, The Pilot, was printed there, inks as well as wooden type and trays would ignite and burn the building within 45 minutes. These structures in some ways were tried in some ways to be contained by the firefighters. This was from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, and it was entitled Into the Jaws of Death. And it showed the firefighters, with insufficient water, trying to put out the fire. But the fire spread, and as it continued to grow, it was almost like a volcano, and one building after the other would burn, creating an infernal fire. Seen here in a painting called The Boston Fire, a view of Boston from across the harbor at East Boston, was painted by F. William Shaw, and though it was painted in 1876, it does give a good rendition. John Demrell described the fire. The conflict raged for 15 hours with an unrelenting fury, and it was the most terrific engagement by the fire department for superiority over the fire fiend ever recorded in the annals of the city. People would come out in droves, and we realized it wasn't just recorded in oil paintings, but even by Currier and Ives in a lithograph of 1873. As you can see in the center, the Massachusetts State House is actually prominent, but on the left, we saw not just the buildings burning, but because Boston usually heated houses and commercial blocks with coal, you're all too young to remember coal furnaces, but this was something that actually had coal wharves, and they projected into the harbor, built of wood, but they also had tons of coal, so it seemed as if the water was burning. By midnight, many of the boats in the foreground were actually to take passengers at $1 apiece, so they could actually watch Boston burn from Boston Harbor. Well, flown away as an eagle towards heaven, the fire burnt throughout the night, creating a macabre scene that could only be likened to that of Dante Alighieri's Inferno. Overworked firemen, frantic merchants, and curious onlookers made the scene one of utter chaos. The fire was so intense that men could see the light flaming against the midnight sky, growing wider, broader, and higher. Its flame so high that it becomes a beacon light to mariners 300 miles away, so bright that it gilds not only the dome of the State House, but surrounding spires, but also lights up the blue hills of Milton. And the epicenter of the conflagration was engulfed in flames. And Frank Frothingham, who also wrote a book in 1873 on the fire, said that blocks of granite weighing tons was split as if by gunpowder and hurled wide across the street, and planks went flying through the airs as if they were feathers. People screaming, firemen yelling orders with no one paying any heed, and the crash of falling blocks of granite, the hum of engines, the roar of the seething flames, the hiss of steam as immense volumes of water were poured in upon the burning mass, and the shouting of the firemen made up a babel of horrible sounds. It was like a pandemonium. Well, many people realized Boston's fire department could not contain the fire. Boston City Hall, beginning at 11 p.m., sent out telegraphs to every city and town within the surrounding areas, not only to send help, but to send their fire engines. But remember, the horses were ill with an epizootic. So seen here in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspapers, this was an etching of the arrival of the special train from Worcester, conveying the Worcester Fire Department with steam fire engines to the scene of the disaster. The frantic and highly charged scene as a fire engine is removed from the flatbed of the train can be sensed as it was eased onto a ramp and then pulled by hand to the fire as hundreds watched from the sidelines. We'd realize that in this detail of Russell's map of Boston, that the pinkish area itself showed the 65 acres. This was not just dry goods, which would eventually become our department stores of the 20th century, but it was also insurance, banking, the leather district, the cotton district, and the wool district. And it was something that was really a concentration of much of Boston's economy. Well, seen here, the day after the fire, it looked as if it was something from Germany after World War II. Areas were completely obliterated. Streets no longer existed because they were covered in both granite as well as brick. And people realized, of course this was a great attraction, that thousands would actually journey into Boston to see this. And seen here from the roof of C.F. Hovey Company on Summer Street, it's now the site of Macy's, but I can't call it anything other than Jordan Marsh. This photograph looks across to what had once been Franklin and Milk Streets after the fire. Russell Conwell said the vista from the vicinity of Summer Street was grandiose and disheartening. Flames flicked up from time to time from the mass of broken, seared, disjointed masonry, played around the cracks and dismantled bases of the great carved iron pillars, and sometimes burst out vehemently from the interstices of the debris. The great columns of smoke rose majestically into the clear air and then formed into party-colored clouds, which cast dull shadows over the scene. Many people realized this was something that not only had been cataclysmic, but it was also something that destroyed old Boston. John Enneking, one of my favorite artists, and I do collect his work, painted the ruins of Boston. And it's a striking scene in its graphic realism of the devastating fire. It was almost as if a thick, blood-red cloud was hovering over the city, as the Boston Globe article from November 11th said, filling the hearts of all with an ominous and indefinable mixture of terror and sadness. Lucius Beebe, the son of James Madison Beebe, said, "Sunday morning dawned on a tremendous yellow pillar of smoke which rolled, like a symbol of doom, slowly over the harbor. And on the left, seen here in the painting, is the spire of the Park Street Church and the dome of the State House." We realize that by this photograph, Washington Street had seen the Old South Meeting House saved. The Amoskeag engine that came from New Hampshire, along with their firefighters, would play water on this wooden spire and its wooden roof throughout the night, and it was saved. Hezekiah Butterworth, who was a fairly well-known poet in 19th century Boston, wrote this little poem. It says, beyond the harbor, calm and fair, the sun came up through bars of gold, then faded into a wanish glare as flames and smoke still upward rolled. The princely structures crowned with art, where commerce laid her treasures bare. The haunts of trade, the common mart, all vanished in the withering air. People were astonished. And of course, the area, which actually encompassed 65 acres, was called the Burnt District. John Damrell, the city's fire engineer, was an integral witness to the destruction of the area by fire and described its progress. The conflict raged for 15 hours with an unrelenting fury. One can only imagine the confusion and anxiety of the firemen as fire chiefs shouted orders from their fire trumpets to men who could hardly hear above the roar of the fire and shouting spectators. Even if they could hear, the scene was one of such utter chaos that it only increased with time. A lack of water power from inadequate sources, and the fact that water could only reach the third story of the 5-story buildings daunted the efforts of the firemen, who watched and were unable to do anything to check the fire's spread. In addition, people were hindering the efforts of the firefighters, and something had to be done. Well, that thing was to call out the Claflin Guards. This is Newton Company C, 1st Regiment Massachusetts Militia, drawn up in formation on Kilby Street at what was then called Liberty Square. It later became known as Post Office Square. Mayor William Gaston of Boston had requested, as Sunday drew to a smoky and hysterical close, that exhausted as they were, the Boston police would not be sufficient to maintain order throughout the city. 6 battalions of state militia were mobilized, and although martial law was never declared so that these had no actual authority, the crowds naturally imagined that they had, and their presence was respected accordingly. We realized that people wanted to get into the Burnt District. If we were a merchant, we'd want to see what survived. Of course, nothing did. But they actually presented these passes to the men and women who owned the property. It says, pass the bearer within the lines enclosing the Burnt District, because the lines surrounding it were double groupings of the cadets. And we realized it was an area because you couldn't imagine where the streets were, let alone the foundations of the buildings. In that instance, seen here in the Old South Meeting House, members of Sheridan's Rifle Guard were quartered in the church, which was still an active place of worship at the time of the fire. A new church was to be built in Copley Square in 1876, but here soldiers posed for a photograph, some leaning on the high box pews, others standing on them, as they were on break from their guard duty. The box pews, which once served as seats for worshipers, now served as hard beds for the soldiers, and they remained here for 6 months. Well, seen here, the Boston police actually would even have their photograph taken at Liberty Square, now Post Office Square. Everything in the foreground, from the Sub-Treasury and the United States Post Office on the upper right-hand side, was destroyed. The building, which was being built from 1871 and would only be completed in 1878, was designed by Alfred Mullett, a well-known federal architect, and it stopped the fire from its progression towards State Street. And of course, seen here, a group of guards actually stand on a pile of bricks and rocks, but with loaded guns. In the days after the fire, thousands arrived to view the charred ruins as photographers surveyed the scene to produce inexpensive and popular stereo view photographs. Seen in the area of Milk and Federal Streets were the ruins of Wright and Potter, the state printer. And though the building was destroyed, the tall brick chimney marks the spot of the business, which has a sign stated that they have relocated to 34 School Street. And members of the Claflin Guard are seen on the right with rifles protecting the Burnt District. Well, what would they be to protect? Well, each of these buildings would have sometimes 2 or 3 different businesses. Each of the companies probably had a safe, and as the wooden floors burnt, the safes would fall eventually into the basement. And it was hoped that the safes would have preserved at least the accounts receivable, nobody cared about the accounts payable, and whatever cash or securities were there. And it was over 35% that actually did have fireproof safes. So they were an important feature. And seen here, a group of merchants and clerks sit on the rocks that were once part of their place of employment. Russell Conwell said in his book, The History of the Great Boston Fire, that the burnt district, in the stead of noble buildings of granite and marble and brick, were huge, giant walls, torn and ragged, and broken columns of stone and iron. The lines of the street were entirely obliterated, and the ways were blocked by great boulders of granite in heaps of debris, in some places from 3 to 10 feet deep, that those who had been most familiar with the section before the fire were utterly unable to find their way, and groped about or clambered over the obstructing rock, brick, iron, and still hot rubbish, of course, dazed and bewildered. And we realized, even here at Liberty Square, that after the fire, canvas tents, temporary wood sheds, and corrugated metal roofs were erected on the cleared area for those working in the burnt district to rest or have refreshments. Here in the shadow of the spire of the Old South Meeting House on Milk Street, men are gathered around a liberty pole as they began the arduous job of rolling miles of canvas fire hoses and clearing away the debris which was dumped into Boston Harbor and along what became Atlantic Avenue. In that instance, in this close-up photograph, which I found on eBay of all places, shows two men in striped blazers. These were the men who opened chop houses. Of course, people had to eat, and they provided food. There were barbers. There were all sorts of different people, including firefighters, merchants, and clerks, just photographed. And you can imagine how dazed they really were. But it wasn't just the commercial blocks that were destroyed. This is Trinity Church that was on Summer Street, now the site of the Filene's building. Trinity, which had been founded in 1729, was the second oldest place of Episcopal worship in Boston, and this was the third structure, designed by George Minot, and built of granite. But seen here, after the fire, it was something that not only showed that the congregation, which had already bought land in the Back Bay and were intending to move into a new building they were to construct, saw this as a horrible loss. The minister at that time was the Reverend Phillips Brooks. He, of course, became the Episcopal bishop of the Diocese of Massachusetts, but he had been rector of Trinity Church since 1869. And he said, the desolation of the fire is bewildering. Old Trinity seemed safe all night, but towards morning the fire swept into her, and there was no chance. She went at 4 a.m. I saw her well afire, inside and out, carried off some books and robes and left her. She went majestically, and her great tower stands now as solid as ever, a most picturesque and stately ruin. She died in dignity. I did not know how much I liked the gloomy old thing until I saw her windows bursting and the flame running along the high old pews. Seen here was the interior. Everything that was wood was actually destroyed. But we see the window that would have been above the pulpit, but in the foreground were the crypts that actually family members had buried since the period of 1729. I don't know if anybody here ever went to Filene's basement, but this is that site. And commenting on the ruins of Trinity Church, Edwin Monroe Bacon said, its broken tower and partly crumbled walls presented the most picturesque ruin of all in that costly conflagration. The interior of Trinity Church had been destroyed of everything except the stone walls, including the floor, exposing the family tombs in the crypt, though the iron doors remained in place. Within just a few days after the fire, the city of Boston notified families to remove the remains and place them and rebury them in a cemetery, among them Forest Hills, Mount Auburn, Woodlawn, Mount Hope, and Cedar Grove cemeteries. Seen here, Milk Street, which extends from Washington Street to Atlantic Avenue, lay in ruins from the rear of the Old South Meeting House to Oliver Street at Liberty Square. Soldiers stand among granite blocks of the ruins of a building, with many men gathered on the street on the right. Every bit of vantage ground, from the dread corner near where the fatal fire began, to the waterside and along State, was crowded with the motley groups of spectators, each asking 100 questions in as many breaths. Two merchants, a policeman, and a man sitting on the right are photographed among the debris and the ruins of the buildings on Arch Street. The tower of Trinity Church is seen in the distance and is enveloped in a haze, creating an almost ethereal scene to the burnt district. It was said approaching the burnt district, one might readily have fancied himself in a recently captured and bombarded town of the Civil War. And here it was said that ladies, of course escorted by gentlemen, would venture into the midst of the burnt district. And it was said that they had been clamoring all day over the ruins of their husbands' and fathers' warehouses, and listening with a sort of pride to their escorts describing the magnitude of their losses. But we realized that the ruins were considered picturesque and fascinating. The devastation of the burnt district was almost incomprehensible. Streets were covered in granite blocks and mounds of bricks, from which iron pillars that had once supported the 5-story commercial blocks lay bent and twisted. The area east of Washington Street was one large debris field that attracted the attention of Bostonians. In that instance, it was something that attracted people, not only as fire aficionados, but also to see the devastation after the fire. And here, a large group of men posed among the ruins of the H.M. Williams Company, a wool brokerage at 42 India Street. 3 signs are visible projecting from the rubble. H.M. Williams and Company removed to 42 India. Merchants began to put up signs on their lots telling where they could be found, and among them were a number that was somewhat laughable. One firm stated very curtly, "We have removed from this place," and another said, "Closed during the heated term." Well, any company that actually was in the suburbs might have an office in Boston. And this was the H&J Pfaff Brewery Company, founded in 1857 in Roxbury by German immigrants Henry and Jacob Pfaff. And its good beer was made from the good, crisp-tasting water of the Stony Brook to produce not just beer, but the lighter lager. With a large German population in Boston in the 1870s, the Pfaff Brewery was extremely popular. And their office was on Arch Street, and possibly the two brothers are seen sitting on these rocks within the area. Of course, all things must come to an end, and Boston emerged from her baptism of fire. In that space of time, it had destroyed hundreds of the costliest and most substantial warehouses in the country. This photograph shows the utter devastation wrought by the fire. Shells of buildings and walls pointing like fingers towards the heavens served as grim reminders of the once urban streetscapes of Boston. The granite would be used for fill for Atlantic Avenue, as well as the wall of the embankment along Storrow Drive in the Back Bay. In that way, photographs done by dozens of photographers who descended upon the scene would think them artistic. And this was called an archway of ruins, which depicted what was once the Boston Button Company on Milk Street, and was photographed by James Black, as well as sketched for Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. It was said that the archway of ruins on Milk Street is an artistic feat of the fire fiend, and presents the appearance of some classical ruin of ancient Rome or Greece, Babylon, Thebes, or Tyre. And even here, a photograph also by James Black shows men standing on the rubble of Brewer and Tileston Company. Thomas Mayo Brewer and John Boyce Tileston were on Milk Street, and they were well-known printers and booksellers. And in the 1870s, they would annually print the Old Farmer's Almanac. Seen here, these 3 granite piers are what remains of the building, with massive granite blocks strewn in the foreground. And of course, A guard stands in front of the triarch entrance to what was once McCullough, Williams, and Parker on Washington Street, now the site of Filene's, with a sign that says that the company had removed to 15 Tremont Street. The company was a well-known wholesaler and retail dealer of ready-made and custom clothing, and the store was one of the largest in the city, extending from Washington Street to Hawley Street. The facade was of white marble imported from Italy and remarkably survived the fire, and though the business was completely destroyed, the archway was reincorporated into their new building. Seen here in a close-up, these fire engines would actually remain within the burnt district for at least 4 months. Fires continued to smolder, and we realized that the cleanup efforts were just incredible. Where would one start? But this photograph shows an engine with firefighters and merchants with the continual movement every day of brick, granite, and iron. A horse-drawn wagon is seen near Congress Street, and Lucius Beebe said, "By the end of the week, the devastated section of the city showed signs of recovered order. And although smoke still curled from numerous cellars, the protective agents were still engaged in tearing down tottering towers and chimneys. Little shops, barber saloons, bars, and chop houses were springing into being under canvas tents or in hastily erected sheds and pine board shelters." But the site was a peculiar one. The utter devastation of the burnt district in the days after the fire was beyond comprehension. Standing on Washington Street, one could see to the waterfront, with whole blocks leveled by the fire. Smoke still rose from the cellar holes where wood and combustible materials lay and smolder, creating an eerie and unearthly light as the dawn broke. It was said that piles of half-destroyed debris or standing walls up which the blaze had climbed and played, while overall hung a dense, murky pall of smoke, slowly floating to the southward in rolling, heaving billows, borne by a gentle breeze. Well, many people realized it wasn't just photographers, but many cartoonists descended upon the burnt district. And this was called Picturesque Scenes and Incidents, and it's a grouping of things that show many things. It was hand-colored, and I actually acquired it on eBay. And the artist was Paul Frenenzi. And it shows the highs and lows of the Great Boston Fire, and it would actually have individual scenes depicting fighting it behind the barricades, the outside aid coming, selling relics, Boston pluck, after the struggle, these and roughs arrested, and looking at the ruins. These appeared in newspapers across the United States. But many people realized in that instance these merchants standing on Milk Street with an area that would be removed as Liberty Square to become Post Office Square as one that nobody could have ever imagined would be destroyed in 15 hours. Seen here, a man rests on a granite block in front of the ruins of Burr, Taft and Company, another dry goods store on Franklin Street. The entrance to the first floor door remains, but the building was destroyed by the fire, but you can see through the openings the burnt district. This was something that was just incredible, and these photographs chronicle this aspect, even here on High Street, seen from Summer Street, with the debris on the right-hand side that went from 3 feet to 10 feet in height as streets were cleared. This photograph by John Sewell is a great photograph that shows a triangular building that was at Summer and High Street that was actually to see only its corner survive. And here, again, in a photograph of Milk Street, the utter devastation shows the debris that's simply been cleared on the right-hand side. It would take 6 months to clean up downtown Boston, but building began as early as 1873. But the thing was, many ministers said that this was a visitation intended to shock the minds of our citizens. The reaction by ministers to the devastation wrought by the Great Fire was swift and condemning, and was to be fodder for sermons for the next few months. F.E. Frothingham said that people, instead of attending divine service, thronged to the streets immediately about the fire and the churches were deserted. I wouldn't go to church. However, the following Sunday, ministers throughout Boston preached on the fire and its implications on life, greed, and loss. The Reverend Dr. Manning of the Old South Chapel preached, "The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away." The Reverend Dr. Webb of the Shawmut Congregational Church preached, "Shall there be evil in a city, and the Lord had not done it?" And the Reverend John Beckley of the Somerset Street Baptist Church preached, "Every man's work shall be manifest when the day shall declare it, for it shall be revealed by fire." Well, in this instance, people throughout the city realized everyone was affected. But newspapers carried this 1 year after the Great Chicago Fire had destroyed most of Chicago in 1871. Seen here, this was done by Thomas Nast, a very well-known political cartoonist, and he called it "Columbia lays aside her laurels to mourn at the burning of her birthplace." The etching, of course, by a noted artist, is something in some ways that shows Columbia, the female national personification of the United States, doubled over in abject grief. In realizing in this, many people saw this in Boston, New York, Baltimore, as well as San Francisco. Russell Conwell, the man who had written a history in 1873, the history of the Great Fire of Boston, would recount the fire on the city, and it's written to place before the present generation, 1873, a readable and trustworthy account of the Great Fire in Boston. Conwell had attended Yale and studied law at the Albany Law School and was later ordained a Baptist minister. He's best remembered as the founder and first president of Temple University in Philadelphia, and today Conwell's name lives on at the Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary here in Massachusetts. Another man who wrote about this was Harvey Washington Wiley, later known as the father of pure food. He was a volunteer firefighter at the Great Boston Fire, joining with others as they pulled a fire engine by hand from Cambridge across the West Boston Bridge spanning the Charles River. He was a student at Harvard, and he said that the engine to which I had been assigned was directly across from my rooming house on Church Street in Cambridge. In a short time, 100 students assembled at the machine, and we were told that the fire was in Boston, and we could see the glow without any difficulty. On either side of a long rope, we started for Boston, and we urged our engine forward with all the power we had, fearing that the fire would be put out before we got there. And the supply of water was not very abundant in this locality because when it was changed from residence to business, the water service had not been enlarged. Even Louisa May Alcott said that the fire was so great that it created a whirlwind and an awful roar. I saw blazing boards, great pieces of cloth, and rolls of paper flying in all directions, falling on roofs and spreading the fire. The granite blocks on Franklin Street went down like a house of cards, and heavy cornices peeled off as if by paper. Firemen could not go up their ladders, the heat was so intense, and many were killed by falling walls. The red glare, the strange roar, the flying people, all made the night terrible, and I kept thinking of the last days of Pompeii. But the man who really chronicled this was the Reverend Cyrus Bartol. He was the minister of the West Church on Cambridge Street in Boston's West End at the time of the fire. He had been graduated from Bowdoin College and the Harvard Divinity School, and not only preached for 50 years, but was a well-known author. The New York Tribune referred to Bartol as probably the most successful minister in Boston, and his sermons were not just powerful, but thought-provoking. His sermon, which was preached on November 17, 1872, was The Trial by Fire. And his sermon was both powerful and thought-provoking, and it said, "For our calamity is our penalty, a fine we pay long ago predicted to our inflammable architecture by prophets of combustion, yet defied by greed of rapid gain, but coming to pass as naturally in the high tinderboxes ranged close together out of the reaches of engines, as you drill a hole and put in the charge and light the fuse or lay the train, the blast follows. Many people looked at these sermons as something that was thought-provoking, but an action was taken. And the governor of the Commonwealth, William Washburne, would realize that the fire was something that had caused him to call the legislature into special session to enable the provision of state assistance for the rebuilding of Boston. Measures passed, including a bill simplifying the establishment of insurance companies, since several went bankrupt by the blaze, and a bill authorizing the city to issue bonds to speed the rebuilding effort, which would encompass 65 acres of Boston. But the governor also declared a proclamation, and this was a proclamation for a day of public thanksgiving and praise. And this was to take place on November 27, 1872, in reaction to the extreme severity of the fire in Boston. His proclamation declared a day of thanksgiving to God, the Creator and Preserver, for the favor shown to us during the year, and that most of our industries have prospered, that our storehouses are filled with an abundant harvest, and get this, and that we have suffered so little from the great fire in our chief city. Well, many people looked at that as a day that many people had done since the 17th through the 19th century. This fire painting by Frank Phelps, done on November 9th of 1872, the painting shows the fire spreading along the docks from East Boston across Boston Harbor. People chronicled it in sermons, in books, in paintings, in photographs. But we realized in some ways one person chronicled it in music. And this is Homeless Tonight, or Boston in Ashes. And it was a song composed by Charles White, and it shows the cover of the sheet music depicting two terrified young girls clinging to one another as they escape from the burning city, with the Tower of Trinity Church on Summer Street in flames behind them. One poignant stanza of the song was, "Who will pity us, and who will give us shelter through this sad and lonely night?" Well, this was something you could replay at home, and it was actually made for piano. And Charles Wright, a well-known songwriter of the period, said in some ways that this was not only mournful, but the lyrics created a sentimental and heartfelt pity for the two young orphans depicted on the cover. The first stanzas were, "Lone and weary through the night we wander, for we have no place to lay our heads. Not a friend on earth is left to shelter us, for both our parents now are dead. Poor mother died when we were both young, yet father made for us a home. But now he's killed by falling timbers, and we are left here all alone." You could play this over and over. But it was springing phoenix-like from the ashes, and the devastation of the fire was tremendous and was a shock, not just to Bostonians, but to the reader of national newspapers. The New York Tribune had reporters and correspondents sending information for the Daily News, as well as artists who sketched the ruins. It was said that the assets of Boston liabilities, the scores of insurance companies that actually failed, stories on the local angle of the calamity and other features might imagine the devastation only of the recent high-pressure reporting. Day after day, new stories were printed, including that in the New York Times, that boldly declared Boston alive again, and that businessmen too busy to mourn over their losses. Well, Boston would rebuild. Beginning in 1873, this is Summer Street. On the left is Church Green, the site of what had once been the octagonal church. Now, the area itself had 5- and 6-story commercial buildings that created an impressive streetscape. Lucius Beebe said that the guilty mansard roof was banished in perpetuity, and the florid cornices were less in vogue. More capacious water mains and frequent and improved hydrants promised a more suitable supply of water in the event of future emergencies. In 2 years, all signs of the conflagration had disappeared, And in a slightly longer period, the ministers of the town and its leading after-dinner speakers had an even wearied of the once compelling phrase, springing phoenix-like from the ashes. Well, the city of Boston would actually declare a city architect of the city of Boston, and that was George Clough. Clough had once been with Snell and Gregerson, but was an independent architect when the city appointed him in 1873 to oversee not just the rebuilding of the new Boston on the ruins of the burnt district, but he would also design numerous schools for the city of Boston, several local churches, and many other municipal buildings and public charitable institutions throughout the city. He would be the first of 16 architects appointed by the city. And seen here was Milk Street after the rebuilding of the fire with impressive buildings, some with white marble facades. The building in the center between the two white marble facade buildings was built on the site of the birthplace of Benjamin Franklin and was called the Franklin Building. And a bust of Franklin within a hooded niche is perched above the entrance and remains there today. The bunting and flags adorning the facades was to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the United States in 1876. So as you can see, within 3 years, areas have been completely rebuilt. It's probably the heat warning. The post office at Sub-Treasury was designed by Alfred Mullett in association with Gridley J. Fox Bryant and Alexander Esty, and was in the process of being built when the fire destroyed the surrounding area. Everybody has it. Okay, turn up the air conditioning. It was the most impressive building built during the Victorian period and was in the Renaissance style and built of granite. On the tops of the two towers flanking the center roof were two 17-foot-high white marble statues by Daniel Chester French. On the left was labor, supporting domestic life and sustaining the fine arts, and on the right, science, which was controlling the forces of the newfangled electricity and steam. And we can see Post Office Square in the front being completely open. Boston, here with Washington Street and the Old South Meeting House in the distance, was rebuilt. Washington Street, looking north from Winter Street, was dominated by the Old South Meeting House, a landmark that was valiant slaved by the firemen from New Hampshire with the Amoskeag engine. The buildings on the right, stretching from Summer to Milk Street, were built between 1873 and 1876 and had a variety of shops, commercial concerns, and department stores. Notice Raymond's in the center, a popular department store that had Uncle Eve as the store spokesperson who touted Yankee common sense with reasonable prices. Well, the book Inferno, The Great Boston Fire of 1872, was written for the 150th anniversary of the fire, but it's something that few people know about in this day and age. My books on history are things that not only I hope make people think, but they're beautifully illustrated to give a glimpse into one segment of Boston's history, of which there are many. But when I did this book, I really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun, and I thank you for listening. Great. Does anyone have any questions or comments? I can't leave without two. So you. Do you have a question? No. Go ahead.
Yeah, with the salvation of Old South Church by the
Amoskeag, yes.
From, New Hampshire, was that sort of the beginning of the historic preservation?
Well, very much so. In 1872, we had to realize that they were moving to the Back Bay, as Trinity was intending to do. And the building, which had so many historical connections, did become saved. But it was actually Mary Hemingway who put up $100,000 in 1876 to buy it from the Old South Association to create a museum, because otherwise it was to be demolished. Yes?
Where did all the money come to be built so quickly?
The city of Boston and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts issued bonds, and you could invest in a bond. It was a 3% return, not tremendous, but it was guaranteed. and that actually allowed people to rebuild. But you couldn't do it until you had cleared the entire city. Now, can you imagine a piece of granite 3 or 4 times the size of the chair you're seated in? Well, they did use it to fill in Atlantic Avenue, but it's also used for the embankment wall. Do you know when you come into Boston from Storrow Drive? Well, on the right-hand side along the back of the townhouses on Beacon Street, much of that granite was reused. But have you ever been to Castle Island? Well, as you go out the causeway, there's actually called a breakwater, and it's granite that goes down from the side all the way into the water. That granite was also reused in the fire. It couldn't be used to rebuild anything. It was not really serviceable, but it could be used as a breakwater, a wall, or even fill. So it really was something that was incredible. Yes?
Did they find the safes?
Well, they did. 35% of the safes actually had intact paperwork, cash, securities, and they're receivable. But unfortunately, the accounts payable had burnt. And they did. Go ahead. Please.
Were there some specific laws that came out of?
Oh, very much so. One of the things that George Clough had to do was to not only make recommendations, but the city of Boston would adopt many of them. Party walls that had to be fireproof. Wood roofs were no longer allowed in the city, and that aspect was a major part. It was done now with metal. But it was also the fact that the hydrant, or what had been called a fire plug, had to have sufficient water pressure to reach the top of these 5-story buildings. But during that period of time, you realize that these buildings, which were changing the face of Boston, was really quite important. And many people realized that if they didn't take heed, it would be something that another fire could actually have taken place. Please. Interesting. Thank you for that. One of the things is I dedicated to the book to the men who died in this fire. There were 21 men. Now, it sounds incomprehensible. It's horrible 21 died, but it's incomprehensible to see only 21 died, but 65 acres of the city was destroyed. There were 19 members of the Boston Fire Department and 2 volunteer firefighters. And they died because of the fire. And as we saw even with Louisa May Alcott, many of them fell into the fire. I mean, this was something that was incredible. Have you ever had a fireplace that actually was a whirlwind and you said that the chimney was on fire? This happened to me a couple of years ago. I was shocked, but it actually created a suction that the heat and the fire went up, and I could see it coming out one of the chimneys. Well, that was something that happened here, so it really was a devastation. And please.
I know of the Coconut Grove fire. Were there any other sort of historical Boston fires?
There were many. The Boston Fire Department did a book in the 1890s that actually talked about fires. If you know where the Paul Revere House is located, it was called North Square. And in 1680, North Square and about 100 buildings were destroyed by fire. The building was rebuilt that Paul Revere bought in 1780, and he would live there, 1770, and he would live there until 1800. So that was rebuilt because of that fire. Fires were everywhere in the city, and I think in a lot of ways it's not just a spark. Remember, this was a spark from a coal fire, a furnace that ignited a bale of cotton, and it started a fire. So the idea is there are many fires, and I'm sure there will be in the future, too. Thank you so much. I do have a couple of books. They're $20 a piece. Thank you.